Good afternoon, everyone. It's Debbie Evans here and a very wriggly Rolo. Today we're delving into the third book in the Secret Adventures of Rolo series. This is The Dragon's Pram, and this is the middle of the book, and it's an adventure set in medieval Salisbury. So I'm just going to launch in. I don't want to give too much away about the action that's happened beforehand, because I don't want to spoil it for you if you want to read it for yourselves. Then I told him what the floppy-haired boy had said about the tomb of the knight without a mascot in Salisbury Cathedral. You better go and find out about the knight then, little pup. You sound as if you're in need of adventure. Go on, back to the 13th century with you. Have you got the orb? Excuse me one moment, Rolo's just been distracted. I'll be right back. Right, he's back with me. Okay, so, where were we? I'll give him a little piece of biscuit and hopefully he'll settle down. Luckily, I brought the pink ball just in case, and I dropped it and moved forward towards the hole in the base of the tree. Yulia and Dar were already there with their lanterns. I had no idea what I might be getting into this time. I seemed to be back at court, but not that of the unpopular King John. His successor was a boy called Henry. I decided the best course of action, like on my last visit, was to stay hidden and see what unfolded. I found my favourite hiding place underneath a long trestle table and watched a boy seated high up on the dais, presuming this to be the young king. I hoped fervently that the feasting knights were messy eaters, for I was suddenly extremely hungry, and there was a delicious aroma of roasting meat lingering in the air. Beneath the table I found myself nestled in between a pair of large feet, and, to my immense surprise, a bone was passed down by a big hand and held out for me to take. I took it gratefully, remembering my manners and not snatching. A few other bits of meat followed, and then a bowl of water was handed down and placed carefully on the floor. I looked up into the kind eyes of a man with black curly hair and thought he looked a bit familiar. The kindly man smiled, belched, and then bent down and wiped his greasy hands on me. Now, steady on, that's what greyhounds are for, not me. I'm not a canine serviette, but I remained silent and put up with the rough handling, licking the grease off with great indignation and a look of disdain. When he had finished eating, the knight got to his feet and scooped me up, tucked me under his arm. I was lifted a very long way off the ground, for he was a very tall man indeed. "Godspeed, Uncle William, and what have you got there, a puppy for me?" called the young boy from the dais, and I buried my face in the knight's cloak in case he felt obliged to hand me over, but I needn't have worried. "Good night, my liege," replied the knight, bowing low to his king and nearly dropping me on the floor, but carefully concealing me with this movement underneath his cloak. Suddenly I realised whom the tall knight reminded me of. This was King John's half-brother, William Longspee, Earl of Salisbury and Sheriff of Wiltshire, amongst other high offices. "You shall be my faithful hound. I need a mascot. I'm not giving you up to be that young king's pet." William Longspee lifted me high in the air with his hands supporting my tummy, and then patted me on the rump as he laid me across the pommel of his saddle before climbing astride his big horse. The horse eyed me suspiciously. I gulped. I remembered what happened to faithful hounds, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be one. I was thinking back to my encounter with Prince Llewellyn in a previous adventure. Not much I could do right now as I lay sprawled across this huge horse and held with a firm hand. We galloped off at great speed, and the tall knight made it clear he wanted me to become his companion and ride into battle with him as a lucky mascot against the French or anyone else who might invade. I wasn't sure about any of this. He took me off to Salisbury Cathedral. It was even more impressive in the 13th century than it is today, because there was not much around it. The beautiful cathedral completely dominated its landscape, with nothing to detract from its magnificence. I was here in 1220 when the foundation stone was laid, the knight explained to me as he carried me around the interior to the east end. This is the plot I've earmarked for my tomb when my time comes, and look, here is the elaborate wooden chest which will hold my bones, and see the great likeness the sculptor is working on now, carving out from stone a perpetual memory of me. I will be painted in the family colours of blue and gold, with lions on my shield. I'm so excited it's all ready for me, but the only thing missing from this happy scene is you. I had no idea what this knight was talking about, and then I realised what he intended. I'm just going to show you the picture, Chantal's drawing of the knight's effigy with Rolo at his feet. It seemed that animals didn't like him, whether it was because he was so big and scary, or for whatever reason, every dog he'd ever owned had run away. He wanted the sculptor to copy my likeness so that when his time for eternal rest came, God willing quite a few years hence, the great knight would be depicted with his feet on the unusual little dog he had rescued and was now parading around like some kind of status symbol. I heard Longspee telling the sculptor that he would bring the little dog tomorrow to sit for a study so that the likeness could be created in position at the feet of the knight for the tomb. I was in two minds about the news. Much as I wanted to make my mark on history and be famous forever, I wasn't sure that I wanted to be commemorated in stone as a medieval knight's footrest. Anyway, I had to get back to my basket and was worried about outstaying my visit. I had to find an excuse to get away from the tall knight, and this was proving difficult because he insisted on carrying me everywhere as if I was too precious to use my paws. He even talked of dressing me up in a velvet cloak and making me a suit of armour. Not cool. I could imagine Chickpea and the other dogs laughing at me dressed up like a doll. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a rat scurry across the nave, and I seized my chance. I leapt out from the tall knight's arms. It was a long way to the stone floor, but thankfully I landed on my feet. Longspee called anxiously after me in a shrill voice, but I was on a mission. When the knight caught sight of what I was chasing, he screamed in a most unknightly fashion. It would appear the brave earl with the famously long sword was terrified of rodents. I chased the rat up the aisle, through the tall and narrow nave with its grey stone walls and dark polished Purbeck marble columns. We were almost at the high altar. I spied the rat cowering behind a column. "Psst, you can go now," I whispered to the quivering rodent. "Go on, Scarpa, vamoose." I waved my paws, shooing the rat away, but it seemed petrified with fear and rooted to the spot. This was no good. I actually needed it to disappear. I didn't want to actually have to catch the thing. It was merely the agent of my escape. "Go," I hissed again and turned away, giving it the chance to scurry off into the sanctuary of the altar cloth. I seized my chance and crept down the shadowy steps to the crypt with the sound of William Longspee's squeals still ringing in my ears. Come back, little doggy, I need you. We will make a fabulous team." If I didn't get out from here fast, I'd be trapped in the 13th century forever with this crazy knight who couldn't keep a pet. No wonder all the others had run away. I had no idea how to get back to the time tunnel as the entrance was some distance away, but suddenly I spied a tiny light coming from behind one of the tombs. It looked like someone was trying to attract my attention as the light flickered like some kind of code. "Julia, I thought I'd come and see what you're up to as you've been missing quite a while. I found another entrance to the time tunnel here in the crypt. Let's go," cried the tiny lamp bearer, pleased to have come to my rescue. I fervently wished I could explain to the floppy-haired boy the answer to his question as to why The stone effigy of William Longspee was the only knight in the cathedral not to have an animal to rest his feet on, but alas, I'll have to keep that knowledge to myself. I did wonder what happened to the hapless knight, and Athelstan allowed me to satisfy my curiosity by sending me back to Salisbury Cathedral nearly 600 years later, in 1791 to be precise. Isn't that the beauty of time travel? I also wanted to know what happened to the cathedral rat that had unwittingly aided my escape after I'd allowed him to get away. The answer is in his tomb, called Athelstan into the time tunnel, his words hanging eerily in the air as I followed the bobbing lanterns through the tunnel. 18th century Salisbury was very different to my previous visit. Lots of impressive houses had been built in an area called the Close, and there were formal gardens laid out with shrubberies and exotic plants introduced by aristocratic gentlemen who had completed the Grand Tour, which was the equivalent of a modern-day gap year, and who had brought back souvenirs, in this case plants. The cathedral itself was just as impressive. This was, after all, the tallest spire in England. Rumour had it that William Longspee had been poisoned in 1226, as it happened not so very long after my visit. It was lucky he'd already designed his own tomb, I thought. I had to get someone to open the tomb. That's what Athelstan had implied. I peered through an open door and saw a clerk to the justices, and from his nondescript appearance I considered he could do with some help to make his name, something dynamic to get him noticed in the legal world. As luck would have it, he could understand me and didn't seem too surprised to be having a discussion with a small but well-mannered, intelligent dog. He listened to what I had to say and got up from his desk, carefully placing the quill next to the inkwell. Perhaps he'd heard that I snapped them in a previous century. We were in a room stuffed from floor to ceiling with books, and he climbed a ladder to reach an ancient tome from its lofty shelf, bringing down a great deal of dust with it. He blew a cloud of dust off the cover and thumbed his way through the pages of the weighty volume, and then read aloud, "According to Roger of Wendover, who commentated on court events during that time, Longspee was thought to have been poisoned by a man called Hubert de Burgh, but for some reason de Burgh was never brought to trial. That's very strange, as Longspee was loyal to King Henry III, so I wonder why justice was not prescribed. Perhaps his tomb might hold some clues." I threw it out there as casually as I could. "Well, if we're going to examine whatever remains of the knight, we need to do it under cover of darkness, which means sneaking into the cathedral. They've been demolishing the Hungerford Chantry on the north side of the Trinity Chapel, and the tombs are being relocated, which should make our investigation a little easier. I was in the cathedral only yesterday and noticed that they were in the process of moving them, so let's hope we can find Longspee without too much of a problem." We passed the time until darkness fell, and after a shared supper of bread and meat, we set off. The tremendous wooden cathedral door opened with a loud creak, and unobserved we entered the nave. It was very dark inside the cathedral, and every sound echoed. I tried not to skitter on the flagstones. "Over here, it's the painted one," I called, and the clerk must have wondered how on earth I knew in the darkness exactly which tomb belonged to the former Earl of Salisbury. "It's a long story," I said, preempting his question, "but trust me, this is him, the one without a dog at his feet." The workmen who were moving the tombs had made our task a lot easier. They'd already shifted the heavy stone effigy. I told the clerk I would stand guard while he lifted the lid of the wooden box, which was the tomb containing the remains of the medieval knight. You will not believe what we found when we exhumed the remains of William Longspee. Delicate readers, pray skip to the next sentence. A black rat, still, as was later found, with traces of arsenic in its body, lay perfectly preserved inside the knight's skull, thus proving the poisoning theory, even if it didn't exactly confirm who had administered the poison. I wonder why he's the only knight without his without his feet on a trusty companion, especially with him being the first person to have been interred inside the cathedral, said the clerk, running his hands over the stone effigy, which had been moved to the side beside the wooden tomb. He was already thinking about the impact the discovery might have on advancing his career, and was wrapping up the rat in his handkerchief to take it back to his office as evidence. Perhaps he just didn't like animals, I added casually, smiling in the dark. I was anxious to get back to my basket now. My curiosity had been satisfied. It had been a busy couple of nights with all this century hopping back and forth to Salisbury, and lack of sleep was catching up with me. I took my leave of the 18th century and at last fell exhausted into bed, snuggled into my blankets, hoping against hope that it was a long time until morning. So thank you very much for listening. I'm glad Rolo settled down after that initial excitement. And tomorrow afternoon, we're going to be delving into the latest book, the 5th book, Phoenix and the Dragonling. And because it's just been Chinese New Year, I thought we would read you the chapter about Rolo and the first emperor of China. So I do hope you'll join us tomorrow at 3:30 with your children, grandchildren, pets, or just a cup of tea. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you. Goodbye.